It wouldn't be fitting as we count down the last two chapters of the book of Genesis in our journey through it for me not to once again remind you of this truth that all of us find it all too easy to forget. And it's simply this, that what we're reading about actually happened, and the people involved are real people. It's a good thing, it's a right thing for us to think through, what does this mean to us? What is God seeking to communicate about Jesus and about the drama of redemption? Those are all good questions to ask, but never at the expense of our commitment to knowing that this is history, that it actually happened. And it's a good and healthy thing for us to put ourselves in this place. I want you to understand a little bit, or think through a little bit, about what it must have been like to have been a part of this family. You have all the dysfunction that goes along with the multiple marriages and multiple wives. You have all the dysfunction that goes with this many people. You know, when you add to the size of your clan, you're probably going to add to the scope of your sin that you're dealing with. But you also have, as a part of your family story, this bizarre reality that God speaks. The God of heaven and earth not only speaks to members of your family, but he has covenanted with members of your family one at a time. That the God of heaven and earth speaks his name as, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Imagine growing up where Isaac is your grandfather, where Abraham is your great-grandfather. And now, here you are. Not only has all this happened, but your brother has been made prime minister of Egypt. I mean, this is not your average family. And now we come to the end of the life of Jacob and the time and commitment that he takes to pronounce blessing on his sons. It's real, but it's surreal as well. You're, again, not your average family. Jacob's not your average father. But he knows that he's dying. He knows that this is his last opportunity to speak into the lives of his sons. And so in chapter 49, he gathers them all together to pronounce his blessing. Now, blessing may not be the best word for it, because as you read through Genesis chapter 49, you see that Jacob has some harsh things to say about that which has gone before, as well as some hard things to say about what is to come. That is, he is not at all shy about reminding his sons about some of their grievous sins, about some of their character flaws, and he's not at all shy about pointing out how some of those are going to be bearing fruit for generations to come in the history of Israel. Oh, there's also that. Not only has God spoken to Abraham, your great-grandfather, to Isaac, your grandfather, to Jacob, your father, but he's renamed your father Israel. And you are now these children, and you are now in Egypt. You're multiplying, you're safe, you're secure, and the conversation happens. Well, what's going on in the conversation? Well, as we noted, there is some recounting of history, some of that in somewhat vague terms, but I suspect that everybody in the conversation knew what was being said. We know, for instance, about Reuben going into his father's concubine, who, by the way, this particular concubine was the mother of Dan and Naphtali. We also know about Simeon and Levi, and Simeon and Levi's sin against the men of Shechem. Now, here's what's interesting about that particular part. He speaks to both of them together, Simeon and Levi, and that's not a mistake, even though his predictions for them, they have one thing in common, but something very, very different. That is, he says to Simeon and Levi, you will be scattered among your people. Well, when the census is given at the time of the Exodus, the tribe of Simeon is one of the largest tribes there are. When the census is given at the entrance into the Promised Land, they're the third smallest. And in fact, their allotment of land is a sort of subdivision of the land that's given to Judah. So there's a diminishing of this second-born son from a position of strength and prominence to a position of neither one. Whereas Levi is also scattered among the brethren, just like Simeon, except that scattering is because of a blessing given to Levi. You remember that the Levites were chosen to be the priests among this nation precisely because they were the ones who rose up and defended God's honor in the context of a rebellion in the wilderness. And as God's blessing upon them, he called them to be that tribe committed to serving in a priestly function within this nation, which is itself serving a priestly function for the world. So yes, they are scattered. They're not given a geographic inheritance, but they're put in this position of honor and authority as the priests in the land, including a position whereby they are provided for by the offerings and the tithes brought by God's people. So both of them, both Simeon and Levi, themselves, the original, the two actual people, did very poorly early on in their lives. But one of the things that we've emphasized as we've gone through this story is the reality of the change among these men, of oftentimes their spiritual growth. I've also pointed out to you along the way that it takes a lot less time to read the story than it took to actually live the story. And so it's very hard for us to get a sense of that process of spiritual maturation that many of these sons are going through. We've talked about that specifically with respect to Reuben and the requirement that someone stay behind with the going and fetching of Benjamin and all of that, and that maturation in that context, we see genuine spiritual growth. And I'm guessing we see it across the board. But that spiritual growth is not the same thing as reaching complete spiritual maturity. Now here's what's interesting. Along those same lines, when the call is actually made to gather the sons for this deathbed pronunciation of blessing, Jacob describes himself and calls for the sons of Israel and the sons of Jacob. Now, what's that all about? Well, I suspect that what's going on there is that this, of course, this is one person, but this is one person who is, as Luther would put it thousands of years later, simul justus et peccator, Latin meaning at the same time just and sinner. Jacob is saying is the one in covenant with God, the one who has been named Israel, the one who's been chosen, the one who's been regenerated and indwelt and who's redeemed on the basis of his hope, which we'll get to in just a moment, is also Jacob the sneak, and Jacob the swindler, and Jacob the trickster. He's not finished, even though he's about to die. And when he dies, he will be finished. At present, he's not yet finished. But neither is this story. I want us to consider for a moment the promise that is made to Judah, wherein Jacob tells Judah that Judah will rule over God's people. This is the first promise, even before David takes the throne, that the scepter will not depart from Judah. But that's not actually what the text says. The text says that the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Well, what's Shiloh? Well, Shiloh is just another way of saying Messiah. Don't forget, friends, going all the way back when we were in Genesis chapter 3 and we talked about the proto-gospel, the promise that God made in the garden that he would send the seed of the woman to crush the head of the serpent. That promise has never been forgotten. It isn't talked about very often, but here in this solemn moment, specifically in the pronunciation of the blessing upon Judah, the promise is brought up again. Well, we don't have the time or the inclination to go through each and every one of these 12 sons and what Jacob has to say to each one of them. I do want to affirm, while we recognize again that they're all still sinners, that many of them, if not all of them, are making strides and maturing spiritually. That doesn't mean, even though they may be forgiven for their sins, that their inclinations, the weaknesses that exhibited these sins, are necessarily gone. Again, going back to Reuben, he's praised and encouraged for his strength and for his leadership, but then all of a sudden he's reminded of how unstable he is in all his ways. And that's the reason why, even though he is the firstborn son, he does not receive all the blessings that go to the firstborn son, which blessings we've talked about were in a very real sense given instead to Joseph by the blessing of his two sons. So, one of the things that's also interesting to note about this particular text is this is the first time in the whole of the Bible, we're in the first book of the Bible, of course, but we're at the end of or near the end of the first book of the Bible. This is the first time that a man has consciously prophesied. God himself made prophecy in Genesis chapter 3. Angels came and pronounced prophecies to Abraham. But this is the first time that a man makes a prediction about the future and describes that prediction as a prophecy. So we are getting ready to move into another stage, which brings us to the last thing I want us to be sure that we cover. And I've mentioned it in passing. It just tickles me. I just love the fact that Jacob wants to be buried back home. And I want you to see in that a kind of foreshadowing of the life and ministry of the one telling the story, Moses. Because you've got to understand something about what Jacob is requesting here. Jacob had to leave the land of Canaan because of famine. He's come now down to the land of Egypt, and he, as the father of Joseph, is given extreme honor, not just by his sons, but by the local people, by the Egyptians. And you know, the Egyptians had their own peculiar style an understanding of the process of burial, which was steeped in honoring the one buried. All of this is a long way of saying that I suspect, I can't guarantee it, but I suspect that given Joseph's standing and given Jacob's standing, that it was not at all outside the realm of possibility that Jacob could have requested a burial not unlike that of the pharaohs, that he could have requested his very own pyramid. But that's not what he wants. Not only does he not get a pyramid, he's asking to have his earthly remains returned to this sort of barren land, this unadorned cave where his fathers and where his wife have been buried. Why is that? Well, I think one of the messages we're trying to get here, one of the messages that Moses is trying to communicate to his audience is not only, hey, just like our father Jacob behaved honorably and was loyal to his people, so I have been, but also, just as Jacob didn't want to be in a place of honor somewhere other than home, just like I left behind the honor that I had in Egypt, the important thing was to get to the land of promise. The promise that God himself had given. That's where the story's going. That's where the history of God's people is going to unfold as the story of Jesus is further manifested and unveiled through various types and symbols of God's people. Jacob wants to be in that old story, not just a part of it, but in it, and he wants his body there as well. And of course, that request is granted, and he is taken to that spot, and that is how chapter 49 ends. I want you to think about this when you may find yourself in the position I'm in. As I'm recording, we are in the few days between the passing of my wife's mother and her burial. And we're dealing with all of the details having to do with that burial. And we're trying to choose this or choose that. And there is a spot that's been chosen for her where she will, in fact, be buried. And it matters because it's going to be that spot from which she will arise when Jesus returns. You know who else will have that happen? Jacob and Isaac and Abraham and everyone who's ever lived, wherever they may be buried, however their remains were dealt with. A day is coming when everyone will be raised again. Some to go to a lake of fire, others to inhabit the new heavens and the new earth. Our heart's desire needs to be like Jacob. Yes, we look to the future. Yes, we pronounce blessing on those who come after us, but our eyes are set on the prize. We're going not to a land flowing with milk and honey, not the land of Canaan. We're going to the true and eternal promised land, to the new heavens and the new earth.